What if I told you that everything you know about human history was predicated upon massive omissions from the historical record? Have you heard of the Tartarian Empire? What about the cataclysmic event that caused the end of their civilization and buried the earth in a layer of dirt and debris? What if I told you evidence of this omitted history is visible in nearly every city on this planet?
Hello, and welcome to Unknowable, the podcast where we talk about all things mysterious, unusual, or unknowable. I'm Justine.
And I'm Gray. This week is it's a weird one.
It's a real weird one.
It's one that I did not know existed.
No, I didn't know anything about it. I still feel like I know almost nothing about it.
There are so many deep dives that are connected to this one topic. Like, you could spend the next, decade researching mud flood and still barely scratch the surface, I feel like.
Yeah, it's intense. So, to sum it up very simply, the idea of the mud flood is the suggestion that there was a major worldwide event, possibly a mud flood,
right?
That buried entire cities and partially buried others,
right,
and wiped out a much more advanced civilization, like a sort of reset.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, the conspiracy part of this entire topic is that records of this major event that wiped out civilizations has also been buried, hidden from the current population.
Right.
And part of what makes this theory kind of off the wall is that it's generally believed, though it varies, that this event happened sometime in the past couple hundred years.
Yeah. Like early 1800s to mid 1800s.
Yeah, that's the general consensus. Of course, there are people who think it happened longer ago. There are people who think there were more than one mud flood, but it definitely makes it a little harder to get on board with when you think this isn't something that they're saying happened 1,000 years ago.
Right.
This is something that a lot of people think this was that's not recent, but that's relatively recent.
Oh yeah.
In our world's history.
Exactly. Yeah, it's super bizarre because you have to believe that basically all of the last 200 years is just completely wrong and predicated upon a complete misunderstanding of all of human civilization.
Yeah.
The consensus basically is that the past civilization built all of the major architectural ruins and or current architectural buildings that we consider even the US Capitol building were built by this past civilization, and rather than the United States or current Russia building these buildings, they dug these buildings out of the debris that wiped out this past civilization.
Yeah.
It's pretty wild.
It's pretty wild. I'll say that one of the theories in Russia, and of course this is that sounds like most of Russia believes this, but that's not.
Who knows?
That Peter the Great was not the founder of St. Petersburg in 1703 in the sense that he built it, but that he dug it out.
Right.
And that's the common thread throughout all of this is that some places were completely buried and some were just partially buried. It's wild. It's a wild
story.
It's totally wild.
And we're going to kind of give a pretty cursory overview of most of this because in order to go as deep as we could, this would be its own podcast.
Oh yeah, it easily could be. And I think part of what makes this topic tough to research in a sense is, I guess, anything that we talk about really, for the most part, there's at least a chunk of it that is factual.
Right.
In the sense that we might talk about missing people or murders or I guess even some of the cryptids and things like that. There's usually some small chunk of things that have been talked about for years and years about this topic, but this particular theory doesn't seem like it's been around for very long at all.
No, I couldn't find anything going back even 5 or 10 years ago.
Yeah.
Seems like a pretty modern thing.
Yeah, it's a modern thing. And one of the when I was reading through, and most of the information we got is from forums.
Yeah.
This
like
is not
Reddit.
really like, there's not articles about this.
Mm-mm.
There are certain things to back up the theory in the eyes of the believers of this theory that are, I guess, more factual, like things that have actually been found that can't be explained.
Mm-hmm.
But as far as like the info about the theory itself, it's really all people on Reddit, and a site that is called stolenhistory.org. The biggest subreddit that I was on was alternative history.
Which, like, another thing that I learned in researching this topic is that alternative history is like a pretty big thing.
It's a huge thing.
Like, it's like, you know, I always just thought of alternative history was like, oh, like flat earthers and stuff. But there's a whole, like, there's some pretty like niche, very specific like alternative history theories that are like very well supported in the sense that there is a trove of evidence that is given.
Yeah.
You know, it's dubious in its reality, but there's a lot out there. It's crazy. It's a whole subset of the population.
Oh yeah. And reading the various threads about the mud flood, it seemed like there were a lot of people that maybe didn't know how to put a name to what they believed.
Right.
So I think there were a lot of people that had like had suspicions and maybe noticed these weird things here and there and were like, what the fuck? And then finally they found, like, you know, they like came home to this forum or this thread and they were like, oh, this all makes so much sense.
Right.
Because there were several people in the threads that said exactly that. Like, I've had my suspicions, but this makes sense to explain it.
Right.
And I was like, oh, damn, like...
It's crazy.
Damn, like, we think we're asking a lot of questions. But there are people out there...
who've been on this for a long time, I guess.
And have a lot more time to think about stuff that are just like, oh. So, one of the biggest bits of evidence for this theory is...
all around you.
Like, I actually wish that we had time to like go and look for ourselves, because I'm sure there's stuff in Portland.
Oh yeah.
So you will start, if once you hear this episode, hopefully you will start to like go and look for this, because it was a thing that I had never really seen. And then you see, I mean, if you go on stolenhistory.org or you go on the alternative history subreddit, you can find like tons of photos of
like
this.
Hundreds of photos
from all over the world, not just the country, not one state, not even just big cities, but all over the world. This kind of weird occurrence of buildings that seem like they're sunken into the ground.
Right. Like, it looks like there's sort of like the building was built and there was like the expected ground floor that was like usually they're pretty like ornate, and like you can tell that they were designed to be like a grand entrance to the building. And then that ground level floor is now deep under the ground, so that maybe like the tops of the windows are peeking out. There's a ton of pictures of those buildings being like excavated, and you can see like the level of dirt. That's kind of like it was clearly built and then covered, and so then the second floor then becomes like the first floor, like the main entrance. And you'll see there's evidence in like New York, like a lot of like brownstones. There's sort of like the walk up to the second floor, and like there's steps down to like the ground floor, what would have been the ground floor. It's pretty wild. There's and when you start walking around a city, you start to notice like the little windows peeking out like on the sidewalk, windows that look like they're bigger, taller windows that have then been like covered in dirt essentially up to a certain level. It's pretty crazy.
And it's easy to write it off as like, oh well, of course a basement needs to have a window.
Right.
And so they just matched the design of the other windows, and it's just a tiny little window. But then, when you see photos of a lot of these buildings being excavated, you see that it was a full window.
Oh, yeah.
That you're only seeing the very top, like, sixth of the window.
Right.
That the other is buried, and it doesn't make sense why you would make an entire window.
Right. Unless it once had daylight.
Yeah. So that is one of the, and like, again, going on the forums, there are just photo after photo of this, and some of them to me were like a little less convincing, but there were some where you're just like, damn, like
whoa, like what happened there?
What happened? The excavation ones in particular, where you can clearly see an entire, not a basement,
right? Not
again, part of why this was a deep topic is I'm like, I would need to learn about centuries worth of like construction standards and like city building standards and how things change and evolve to like really be able to discount or suspect any of these things, because I don't know about how they built cities in the 1800s. Like, I just don't know.
Yeah.
Again,
me neither.
Disclaimer.
Yes.
I'm not a doctor. I'm not a scientist, and I'm not like construction historian. Is that a thing? Like
sure.
a city building? I don't know.
That sounds right.
A city historian. I don't know shit about that stuff. So I don't know if there is some reason why that would be a thing, but it doesn't make sense in my mind that you would build out an entire window or an entire doorway, especially like the windows. I could almost see like maybe somehow it makes sense to do a regular window. I don't know, but the doorways, why would there need
like these
to be
ornately carved doorways that are like very clearly meant to be like the ground floor entrance, like the main entrance to the building,
and you can only see the very top of like the decoration of the door or something from the street level, but like underneath you see there was a doorway that there's no reason to have a doorway for a basement that's intended from the beginning to be underground, unless that basement was not underground at one point.
Once above ground.
So so I feel like we're gonna jump around a little bit because there's not
there's not like a coherent thread to follow through this.
No, there's no timeline.
Kind of have to flesh out like the different sort of like components that fit together to build a whole narrative.
And I think, I mean, maybe in like 10 years even, if this continues to be a theory, will be a much more fleshed out theory with like a more single thread running through it. But right now it was a very tough thing to research because, again, you're reading through a forum of just people who are just like, hey, I think this is what happened. Like, hey, this timeline doesn't make sense. People going all the way back to like Noah's Ark level history here.
Oh man.
So I mean, like,
there's a lot of talk of like young Earth theories. They're like, oh, in order to believe this, you have to believe in like the young Earth timeline.
Oh yeah.
So it's like
there's a million different timelines. So it was like, in order to not bore the hell out of all of you with like 18 different timelines and confusing the shit out of you, so you're like, what the hell are we talking about anymore? We kind of just kept this a little more basic. But so one of the interesting things that I read about was this notion being backed up in some people's minds by these several paintings completed. A lot of these were in like the 17 to 1800s. Some were in the 1600s. By what are known as Capriccio artists. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. Also not Italian.
Also not Italian.
So Giovanni Battista Piranesi, who lived from 1720 to 1778, also just known as Piranesi.
Right in like the time period we're talking about.
Exactly. Right in that time period. He was among these artists. So there's several etymologies put forward for the meaning of the word Capriccio. Again, pronunciation questionable. One is that it's derived from the Italian word capretto, which roughly translates to the unpredictable movement of the behavior of a young goat. Oh. Which is awesome. But that would suggest that this artistic style is unpredictable and based on imagination. The word can also mean following one's fancy. So there's sort of, in a lot of these things, I don't know. Again, you could go deeply into the topic of these Capriccio artists, which I did not do, but you can if you feel so inclined.
Please do.
You, as in the listener, not you, as in Gray, that I'm looking at right now.
Looking me dead in the eye.
Look it up now. But so it's unclear if these artists were named such in the time period that they were creating art, or if this, obviously there are a lot of things like that are named later on in the timeline where we're kind of going back and being like, oh, like there tends to be clusters of artists and clusters of musicians that kind of do something similar in a time period, and then they are named for later on.
Exactly.
So it's unclear, but maybe not unclear to anybody, but it's unclear to me. So this Italian art historian Filippo Baldinucci defined Capriccio as a dreamlike interpretation of the subject of a work that comes from a free imagination.
Okay, so he's just making shit up.
So they often have a landscape element to them. With many of these paintings showing like very known cities of the time in ruins. Which is interesting. So part of the theory that ties into the mud flood theory, or ties into these various theories of there being like this big civilization reset, is that these are not the result of imagination, but these were observation of a real event, which is insane when you think about it.
That's
like,
wild, yeah.
It's so cool. Of course, the other explanation is that the artist adopted this style as a metaphor for the transience of human existence, which is also fucking cool. They're both cool.
Either way, it's cool.
So, and one of the people in one of the threads that I was reading, which made me go back and look at some of these paintings, was he was talking about how almost more striking it is to look, like oftentimes some of these paintings are just the ruins themselves, but a lot of them have people in them, and the people are just very casually
Yeah, just chilling.
Like they're going about their daily life. Maybe they're like sweeping up, like they're cleaning.
Yeah.
But it conveys a type of nonchalance that implies that this is something that is not unexpected.
Right.
Like
it kind of reminded me of some of like the shots of like post World War II, like Berlin, of people, you know, they're just like kind of going about their daily life, like their apartment building has been destroyed by bombs or whatever.
Yeah.
But they're just kind of doing their thing. They're just sweeping up like the debris. They're just, you know, buying bread, whatever, just going about their lives.
Yeah.
So it kind of reminded me of that, where like this is like a generation that has experienced some calamity or tragedy, and they've taken it in stride, and they're just kind of going about their daily lives because like, what else can you do?
Right. Yeah.
There's still like seems to still be some sort of like government structure. There's some structure to society so that they don't feel like the anxiety of like anarchy or something. So there's not just like the complete absence of civilization.
Yeah.
But the past civilization has been destroyed in some way.
Right.
It's wild.
It's fascinating.
Yeah.
You would think if these paintings were an observation, and that this crazy destruction of a large portion of civilization was completely unprecedented,
right,
that had never been heard of before, that they would be, you know, we'd be showing people in anguish.
Right, exactly.
Like, freaking out. But they were just like, well, we knew this was going to come
suck.
eventually. Yeah. Like, sucks to be us.
Yeah.
This is shitty. So that was kind of interesting. But then, of course, you know, who knows?
Right.
Maybe these were really just, I mean, that kind of cool thing, really, if you think about it. Like, these artists, if this wasn't something that happened, they were just like, dude,
let's draw some blown up stuff.
Yeah, like, let's get deep. We're going to have, like, known landmarks around our own city. Like, if somebody was painting stuff like that now, which would be fitting as well.
I'm sure there's somebody out there who photoshops.
Yeah.
Oh, no, they totally, I've seen that before, yeah. People who, like, Photoshop, like, modern New York City into ruins.
Yeah.
It's kind of a thing.
Yeah. It's like, we just watched just part of the first season of I forget what it's called because it was not a great show. But it had, who's the guy who plays the dude from 24?
Jack Bauer.
Yes, Jack Bauer.
I don't know his real name, but his name is Jack Bauer.
Damn, I cannot think of that guy's name. Anyways, the guy who plays Jack Bauer is in this show that is kind of like, essentially we boiled it down to like government drama for idiots type of show.
Okay.
You know, like a lot of the government drama shows like can be very complicated as far as like talking a lot about like diplomacy and these different, like the infrastructure of the government, which for me can be kind of boring and just like, I don't know what the hell you're talking about. But this was very much a show where like every scene they're like, you know, repeating what just happened in like simple terms, which they would not do.
Or
like you wouldn't.
A quick recap for the people who don't know what they're talking about.
Yeah, exactly. Like somebody like boils it down to like really basic terms, but they're still talking to like another White House aide, you know, like who doesn't need to know that. But like, they're doing it for us.
I just heard what just happened. Yeah.
Yeah, like I know, and like I know what these words mean. So it's kind of like that, but we part of that was that the entire Capitol building was like blown to hell.
Oh yeah, designated survivor.
Yes,
that's what you're talking about. Yep.
What was that guy's name?
I don't know.
It's
Jack Bauer.
It's Jack Bauer.
Yeah.
Damn, he's like not even just known for Jack. He's like a pretty decent like big actor, but eluding me right now. But anyways, that reminded me of like it was weird to see the Capitol building.
The Capitol building in ruins.
Yeah, that we know would like all ties together, man. Whoa. So that was one of the things that these people who believe in the mud flood use as somewhat of a reference to like, what about this though?
Right, like it's a almost like a historical documentation of cities that we know well that have existed for a long time in ruins. And yeah, I guess now would be a good time to get into like the civilization itself that we're talking about.
Oh yeah.
So it's not just a amorphous civilization. It is known as the Tartarian civilization. They are like the Tartars, which, like, spoiler alert, is a real historical documented civilization. Yeah, like it was a group of people. They were, I believe it was Mongolian. Like they're, you know, like the descendants of Genghis Khan who were ruling parts of Mongolia, Western China, Southern Russia, and like as far west as like Turkey.
I'm always trying to. Is it pronounced Genghis?
Genghis.
Did I just not know that?
That's like the more if you. It's Genghis Khan.
Really?
It's actually, if you see it written in Mongolia, it's actually Chinggis, like Ching.
I didn't think that you got it wrong. I just had one of those moments of like, have I been saying this wrong my whole life?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, man.
I always thought it was Genghis.
Right. That's like the classic like
Damn.
uninformed white person way to pronounce it. No offense, but
I mean,
like it's been pronounced that way for hundreds of years.
I'm not alone.
But yeah.
Wow.
It's like calling him Genghis Khan is the equivalent of who's that cowboy guy? John Wayne. Oh. John Wayne played Genghis Khan in some movie.
Yikes.
So that's the equivalent. John Wayne playing Genghis Khan.
So I'm John Wayne right now.
You were John Wayne. Pronouncing it Genghis. So
okay, cool.
Yeah, Genghis Khan. Wow. Genghis.
I learned something.
Genghis Khan. So yeah, his descendants were known as like the Tartars. And so the Tartarian empire civilization was like essentially Mongolia or Western China. So this is like a real thing. So that's like the historical Tartarian Empire.
Yes. But this is not just a belief. This is real.
That's fact that existed. The conspiracy comes in that people say that the Tartarian civilization was actually this massive global like civilization that basically, if you believe the mud flood theory, then they essentially built all of the major architecture and infrastructure around like the whole planet. Damn. And then were wiped out by this cataclysmic event that buried the whole earth, and that's what wiped out the Tartarian civilization.
That's wild.
There's some weird ways that they like justify it and like give evidence for it. Like, for example, so Napoleon famously invaded Russia. I think it might have been during the time of Peter the Great. I think it was Peter the Great. But so Napoleon
1700s?
Yeah.
Ish.
That's about, I think that's when Napoleon was doing his thing.
Sure.
But yeah, so Napoleon like famously invades Russia, gets turned back by the Russian winter, and it's like the first defeat that Napoleon had. Same thing Hitler did 100 years or a couple hundred years later. But somewhere in, I think it's St. Petersburg, there is a plaque or like a commemorative thing that was built that features both the face of Peter the Great and Napoleon on it. And people look to that as like, that would be like the equivalent of having like Hitler's face on the same commemorative plaque as like Stalin. Like there's no reason why like the two opposing forces in a battle would have a commemorative plaque in this place. And that is part of the evidence, as well as there's some document where Napoleon is referencing like the Tartars or the Tartarian Empire or something. So the idea is that Napoleon wasn't actually invading Russia. Russia and Napoleon were fighting together against the Tartarian Empire.
Crazy.
Right? So there's again, super deep dive. Like the whole Tartarian Empire thing.
Oh, yeah.
It's like this crazy deep. It gets pretty anti-Semitic and just kind of generally racist in a lot of ways. It's similar to like how the whole Nordic peoples have been co-opted by like Nazis as like the master race. So a lot of people look at like the Tartarian, or not a lot of people, but like white nationalists and Nazis look at like the Tartarian civilization as like the true master race that was this Caucasian group of people that took over like the whole planet, and then the cataclysm happened and their civilization was wiped out. And so now the people who currently inhabit places like Africa and South America are, not supposed to be living on their own lands.
Wow.
So it's kind of troubling. If you go, I think, if you go deep enough on any subject on the internet, you're going to find white nationalists have taken something and co-opted it.
Hate them.
But so that's the civilization that supposedly built basically any marble colonnaded building that you see anywhere from Rio de Janeiro, Washington D.C., St. Petersburg, Paris. Any of those are supposed to have been built by the Tartarian civilization.
Crazy.
Then were buried, and then when the Tartarian civilization collapsed, then these lesser survivors of the cataclysmic event dug out these cities, and that's who we are now descended from.
Whoa.
And for some reason buried all of that history of all of that.
Yeah. Right. And I guess that's the big question.
Like I never got a clear why.
Right.
I mean, same thing with like the whole flat earth theory. Like, why is NASA covering up the fact that the earth is flat? Like, why wouldn't we just accept that?
Right.
You know what I mean? Like I understand like the mechanisms of like how it could happen, but I don't understand the why. It would be such a massive thing.
Yeah, that's what I thought when watching. I forget what that documentary was called, but the documentary about the flat earthers that was on Netflix, and which was hilarious.
Oh yes,
it was hilarious. I honestly was afraid that I would watch it and like be like
converted.
Yeah, like this is something to roll around a little bit, but no, it was actually just hilarious. And Yeah, I don't know if flat Earth will ever be a topic on here, just because I don't really think it's unknowable.
No, and I was thinking that myself. Like, should we do a flat Earth episode? And I was like, no, because it's not unknowable.
Because that to me implies that we think that like it's a possibility, and I pretty much every other thing we talk about, I do think has some basis to it. And flat Earth, I just don't. Yeah. And yeah, part of it is, and I was hoping maybe it would be explained in that documentary, but I feel like I got no answer to why anybody thought that this was worthwhile to lie about. Right. Like, what was being covered up, and why?
What's like the motive? Yeah. Other than to like keep humanity in the dark about our actual like history. I don't. It doesn't make sense to me.
I'm like all about the world just being the X-Files, but this particular thing, I'm like, no. Right. I don't see what the benefit is to anybody to lie about that. So yeah, I didn't even like dive into the Tartaria thing because it was just so intense, and I knew that you were diving into it, so I was like, nope. Because every time I clicked into it, I'm like, there's so much. There's already so much for this topic. But the one little snippet that I did see about the Tartarian civilization was the fact that this was like you said, like this was a known country. People like with their own flag, their own government. Like this was not like a tiny little subset of people. Oh yeah. This was not like a village or something. This was like an established civilization. And it seems like there's at some point it just kind of shifts to like referencing them as if they were just some tiny little tiny little town worth of people, when it was like a country. Oh yeah. And so like it just seems weird, like why are we all of a sudden pretending like this was major, not as big as it was. Right. So that does and again, I don't know why. Like why are we covering up the fact that they existed in this on this massive scale and then didn't? Don't really know.
There's also some like some of like the symbols that we see around us all the time are supposedly relics of the Tartarian civilization. No way. For example, the two-headed eagle that you see on, I think it's on one of the Russian flags. It was definitely the German Empire right before Hitler took over. Whoa. It's like the classic like old German flag. It has like the two-headed eagle. You could even argue that the Great Seal of the United States, where it's the eagle holding the arrows in one hand and the olive branch in the other claw, and how its head supposedly, like if we're in a time of war, the head is turned to the claw that has the arrows, and if we're in a time of peace, it's turned the other way to the olive branch. So if you think about it, if you take it together, the eagle's looking both ways. It could be like a double-headed eagle. Supposedly the swastika is a relic of that civilization. Wow. And so Hitler was continuing on that, the whole white nationalist thread. Hitler was a continuation of this Tartarian empire and was trying to make Tartaria great again. Whoa, take it all over. No. So
terrible.
It's there's so much. Wow. It's too much to unpack.
Oh yeah.
And if you just take away all of the racism, it's a very interesting story.
Yeah, it is. And that's definitely a big undercurrent of this mud flood theory. Tartaria, like if you dig into the mud flood theory at all, you're gonna see stuff about that civilization. So yeah, so that's again like everything we've talked about so far can be delved into like times 10. Exactly. If you so choose. So yeah, so part of what I did was like finding a few examples, because again, there are tons, so many of places in the United States in particular, which I just decided to focus on. Yeah. United States, whatever, that kind of were examples of like these weird buried cities that we have no explanation for. Again, maybe that is really the only factual thing we have, is that these places do exist. Oh yeah. There's just no...
That's why when we were researching this, I was like, okay, like this is a wild theory that requires me to suspend a lot of disbelief. Yeah. But then you start to see the photos of it and you're like, okay, this isn't just like making shit up. This is like taking actual evidence that we have all around us and coming up with a theory to explain it.
Exactly. Like these things do exist. We don't know why, which is part of why theories come about in the first place. Right. Not just that these things exist and we have an explanation given to us and we just doubt it, which is its own thing, and it's valid to be like, I'm not just going to accept, especially like what the government tells me, because they do have other agendas. But the idea that like there are things that even like historians and things like who have gone and done the research necessary are like, we don't know. Like we have no clear thing for this. So one of the examples was in Chattanooga, Tennessee. Nice. This archaeologist and University of Tennessee Chattanooga professor, Jeff Brown, started noticing these clues that there were like this underground city while walking around downtown Chattanooga in the 1970s. He learned from utility workers of doorways leading to nowhere and underground tunnels and rooms. There were entire basements of buildings that were once first floors, again, which we've talked about, including some obvious storefronts complete with windows.
Wow.
Which, again, like, I feel like there are some things that you can kind of explain.
Oh, yeah.
But then a storefront with windows just makes no sense to me.
Was not built purposely underground.
Exactly. None of these were marked on maps, and no one could really tell him why these features were there, why they would have been underground. He discovered that much of the city had been backfilled. So I had mentioned this to my husband, and he's like, I know what backfilling is. It's like, okay, construction or a hardware store guy.
Exactly.
But backfilling is something that happens after excavation when the soil is compacted back into the trench or the foundation.
Right.
Just FYI. By as little as 6 feet in some areas of the city and as much as 20 feet in others. So, again, there's not really historical documentation backing up the raising of the city streets. Some suggest that it's just a legend, but some say it was common practice for the basements in buildings downtown to like have, like you said, stairs leading down from the street. Some even with like handrails. The windows were just explained as like lighting and ventilation.
Right.
And even the archways underground in some buildings, people said it was just structural support.
Interesting. So I guess the idea would be that you have a main street, you have buildings along Main Street, and you would either build it so that there was essentially like a basement that was connected to the main street with a set of stairs, and that at some point that set of stairs and like that whole front space was backfilled again. Yeah. And so then what was the second floor then becomes the ground floor. Yeah. And it gets forgotten.
Exactly.
So, yeah.
So
it's a weird thing.
Yeah. But apparently in the 19th and early 20th centuries, Chattanooga had like this systematic flooding, like about every decade or so. Right. In March of 1867, they experienced a record flood with the river rising 53 feet. Jesus. Which seems insane to me. Yeah. This was like 4 days worth of heavy rainfall. And so sometime between 1875 and 1875 and 1905. I knew I typed that wrong when I typed it. I was just like in a flurry, man. Right. Chattanooga built up its roads and abandoned the first stories of many buildings, but no one today knows exactly why. Obviously, it's theorized that it was to escape the flooding. Right. This has been done in our country before. Oh, yeah. Boston and I think Chicago was another example of this actually happening. Maybe it was even to lessen the impact of yellow fever that was killing thousands in 1878 or so. It had killed like a good 150 or so in Chattanooga at the time. They didn't know at the time that yellow fever was carried by mosquitoes, certain type of mosquitoes. I guess the same type that now carries the Zika virus. Okay. But there was the then registrar of vital statistics had said something about connecting the filth in the city to the occurrence of yellow fever, which he was kind of right. He didn't maybe know why at the time, but the fact that there was this constant flooding and that this like it essentially could like never really get fully dry. Right. That was I see. Yeah, more breeding mosquitoes, grounds. Yellow fever. So they were thinking maybe it was like in some effort to like build up to cover up this filth or whatever that was causing yellow fever. But the whole thing is that documentation of the construction is really scarce, and city records don't point to any motion where city leaders actually decided to do such a thing, which just seems weird because that's not a small thing to do. Right. Newspapers from the time kind of discussed the proposal of the idea, but they didn't really do anything to document the event happening. And even modern city historians have a hard time answering questions as basic as like, where did they get the soil from? Right. Or how did they accomplish such a massive undertaking? So there's been theories that like they dug out this basement of this Hamilton County courthouse, which I guess is pretty substantial. And so like maybe the dirt was taken from there or like a nearby hill. But like the fact is that there's no proof either way of how they did this. Why wouldn't there be documentation? Like, again, this is not just like one day we did this. This would be like a huge thing.
Oh yeah. This would be like, especially back then, like it's not like you could just have like bulldozers and stuff. Yeah. You're doing this by hand.
Insane. So crazy. Why isn't there... So the theories are sound. Like, yes, there was like tons of flooding and that makes sense that they would do that. But why is there not...
Something happened.
Something happened. And then the other example was Leavenworth, Kansas. underneath the sidewalk of downtown Leavenworth sits a 200-year-old system of tunnels. Very little is known about this underground city. Researchers who examined the place found windows, doors, and narrow paths beneath a title company that leads to storefronts stretching several city blocks and perhaps beyond, referred to as the Leavenworth Underground.
Ooh.
So, yeah, some speculate that businesses just added stories over time as like the paved roads and new construction standards evolved. But others say like the Underground Railroad. There was somebody, again, like diving into the history of the Underground Railroad was like a bit of an undertaking. So somebody somewhere was talking about the town itself was founded in 1854, which was really only a few years before the Civil War.
Right.
And the earliest settlements were maybe 1827, but I guess the size of this town was only like 7,000. So it seems unlikely that like a significant Underground Railroad stop would have existed in such a small town, especially with it being founded so soon before the Civil War.
Yeah.
So that doesn't seem like a very plausible explanation. So again, this is like a whole underground city,
right?
In a way, like a chunk of a city that people don't know why it was there or why it's covered.
Right. That's what's weird. Is like the documentation. I feel like every city has, stuff under it that's like old tunnels, old subway tunnels and stuff. The thing that makes it interesting is when it's like unexplained or that people like don't have a reason for it to be there.
Yeah.
That's a bizarre.
Exactly. Like it's one thing for it to exist, and obviously some of them do have explanations and whatever, but then there are some where it's just like, where did this come from?
Right.
And the third example I found was in Tampa, Florida. There was an article from November 2018 talking about this Ybor, Y-B-O-R?
Ybor City.
Ybor.
Yeah.
Ybor City in Tampa, Florida. This is like an old historic city. Developers of a new office building were doing demolition and discovered these mysterious tunnels. Which again, there was a theory that they were used by Prohibition-era smugglers and bootleggers, but there was a professor that talked with a news station that said that public corruption in the early 20th century Tampa would have made it unnecessary for organized crime to need to be stealthy.
Right.
And he thought maybe it was part of a network that transported Chinese prostitutes from Cuba to the port of Tampa in Ybor City in the early 1900s. But like ultimately, again, we don't know why those tunnels were there.
Yeah.
So it seems like that this is like a repeat occurrence in various parts of the world.
Yeah.
Where there's just these weird things being discovered, whether it's on purpose or by accident. That's just like, why was this here? And why is there not anything to back up like, oh, this is why. Right. Again, some of it, if it was a tunnel for transporting prostitutes, probably not documented anywhere. Right. So there's that side of it, which is like, isn't necessarily like, oh, if there's no newspaper articles about it, it didn't happen. Or it was some big cover up. Like maybe it was just something fucking shady. Right. Shady and illegal. Yeah. So there's that too. But it just seems wild that it's such a common thing that again, like I didn't even look. And that's part of like the creepiness of the conspiracy side of it, is that there's things like that can exist in the world that like if you don't know to look for it, you'd never see it. You have no idea it's there. Yeah. It's freaky. Except for these people on these forums. Yeah, exactly. Who are just like, they notice and we're like, what the fuck, guys? And everybody's like, what are you talking about? They're like, dude, look. Yeah. Like, what is this? And they're just like, oh, that's just, we always just build an entire first floor and like deck it out. Like, I don't know if it was the Kansas one, but one of the ones that had like storefronts, like there was even like, there was evidence of like the window having been painted with like, a 10-cent like price or whatever. Oh yeah. And again, they couldn't really pinpoint an era because it was like without knowing what cost 10 cents, you couldn't really be like, oh, that matches up with whatever. But it was still like, again, proof that this was not just like, oh, they always built a first floor and then covered it up. Like that would just makes no sense. That does not hold water to me. Yeah, you would not like paint the windows as a storefront and then cover it up on purpose. Like that's something else. And yeah, so it's just crazy. And I had heard a story on another podcast about Seattle specifically and how Seattle was built. And I think it was a similar situation where there was like a ton of flooding. And so they just purposefully sort of like, so they had like a main street or whatever that was running through, and they built another layer above it because like they just let the water run down there. And so there was essentially like, 2 levels of like retail shops. And so there was like ones that were fully underground and then there was ones above. And so for some time you could go to both. Whoa. There was shops at both, but then eventually they just backfilled all of the bottom part. And so now same idea where you can
go down into like the basement and see like a window that literally just has dirt behind it because it's been filled in.
Yeah.
So I wonder, I feel like a lot of these there's very plausible explanations that are not like, I guess this isn't like supernatural, but that aren't like a conspiracy.
Right.
Like, you know, back in the day, people would just throw their piss and shit out their out their top window into the street.
It's horrible.
Horses, like everybody rode horses everywhere, so they're just pooping everywhere. And you figure if you're doing that for enough time, it's gonna, you know, start to build up, and so you're essentially slowly backfilling a main street. And if that, it would make sense that it wasn't necessarily documented, because if it just keeps happening slowly over the course of, you know, a generation or two, a couple, I mean, 2 or 3 generations, you wouldn't have documentation about that. It would just be all of a sudden, you know, the storefronts are getting more and more covered, and then you just backfill some more, and then eventually the whole first floor is mostly underground, and there wasn't any one event that did it, so there wasn't any news coverage about it. It was just sort of a slow process.
Yeah.
Or like, you know, like the dust storms that happened in like, you know, Kansas and stuff like that during like the 1800s, when there would be like a bad crop year and there'd be no like vegetation to like hold the topsoil down, and it would get super dry and blow around. I could conceive that a town in Kansas would get buried in a dust storm all of a sudden, and it could be traumatic enough that there wouldn't be like, you know, active news coverage about it, because everybody would just be trying to survive.
Yeah.
So I feel like there's some plausible explanations, but then there's just, you know, the fact that it's global is a very strange thing. Like a lot of those photos that were on that Stolen History website were like particularly like Russian and Eastern European.
Yep.
And it seems like it's a huge thing in like St. Petersburg specifically, that there's a lot of these like buried buildings.
Yeah. It's insane.
It's bizarre.
Oh yeah. One of the theories that I didn't get super into, but that was just briefly mentioned somewhere, was like also the theory of an earthquake.
Mm-hmm. Oh
like
yeah.
A massive scale earthquake.
Rather than it being buried, it like sunk.
Yeah, it actually sunk.
Interesting.
Which is interesting too. I would think, again, not a quick expert.
Seismologist.
Yeah. I would think that if that were the case, that like the buildings that were underground would be more damaged.
I was going to say, I don't think you just like,
right? They wouldn't just
casually just slip under the ground.
They would just like shimmy their way down and just be like, bye. But and again, like that is even more, I mean, both of the options, like the mud flood and the earthquake, are still confusing as to like, why would there be no documentation?
Right. Unless it was such a cataclysmic event that there just wasn't able to be news coverage because people were just too busy trying to survive and like get by.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a ton of theories as to what like the cataclysm could have been. Earthquakes, volcanic eruptions. Somebody specifically talked about like, what if like the Yellowstone supervolcano had erupted?
Yeah.
Like the eruptions of like Pompeii and Santorini, like buried whole Roman towns that we now are excavating, and they're basically like frozen in time. I feel like if that was true though, there would be more specifically like volcanic ash everywhere. Like I feel like
exactly
scientists would pick up on that. Like, wow, like this we find volcanic ash at this certain level, like under the ground all over the earth. What happened, you know?
Well, like, I don't, again, not an expert, but how is it even possible for there to be one volcanic eruption that could do the same thing all over the world? Are we saying that these things happened, like, was there some type of like chain reaction? Is that even possible?
Right, like multiple volcanoes erupting at once.
Yeah, at once, or even spaced out, like it was happening to different countries or different areas, like at different times in the same general time period, which again is like far enough ago that we wouldn't, you know, I don't know.
Right.
But basically all the theories are that exact type of thing where it's like, maybe it was this, but like that doesn't make sense. But like, does it? I don't know.
Does it?
Like,
right.
I'm not enough of an expert to know. I can't definitively say like yes or no.
Right.
So there's a lot of stuff like that where it's just like, like one of the other topics that is related to this that I just could not dive into was the Catacombs of Paris.
Oh yeah.
People theorize along with the mud flood and just generally with the idea of like a massive reset. To a lot of people, it does not make sense that there are 6 million dead in the catacombs, which I didn't know that number.
That's a lot of people.
Yeah. Until I was looking this up. And of course, like the explanation is that they ran out of room in the cemeteries, in one big cemetery in particular.
Mm-hmm.
And again, this was like something I couldn't totally get into because there's a lot of numbers involved. When you get into like history like that, you can't even just go by like basic math of like, oh, you know, this was the population at this times and it would have like increased by this, because you have to take into account the fact that there are like massive plagues and things like that wipe out people, or like wars.
Mm-hmm.
It isn't so, you can't calculate it so exactly to be like, oh, because there are big things where like there, you know, there's like, the actual plague wiping out people.
Right.
That's
Spanish
a huge
flu.
chunk of people. Yeah. That are just gone. And then there's like, you know, a Renaissance period of like kind of rebuilding.
Mm-hmm.
So numbers are bouncing around. And again, I'm looking at just somebody in a thread that's talking about this. And you can get deep into like even just the Wikipedia page for the catacombs. So it's like, oh shit, there's so much.
So much.
And one of the people in the threads did say that there had been like this massive cemetery that, you know, from the time of its start to when the catacombs were being developed or whatever, that there were like 2 million buried there, which seems crazy too. Like how big was that cemetery?
Right.
Holy shit, 2 million people.
Right.
So like when you look at it that way, you're like maybe 6 million isn't that much if like already just 2 million were put in there.
Right.
The numbers are mind boggling.
Oh yeah.
To begin with. And so, but there's some thought of that of like, how could there possibly, like why, what's so special about Paris essentially? That we have cities nowadays that are much larger than Paris was at the time of the catacombs being started. I don't even know what word to use for that.
Right.
So why are there not more places like the catacombs in other huge cities that, like, again, like current day are way bigger and, you know, have been around for a long time? Like, why wouldn't there be catacombs like this? And there are other similar things.
Right.
But it, like, you would think, like, why isn't there one of these in like every huge city?
London.
Yeah. Like everywhere. Berlin. So that makes it suspicious. Like, was there something? But I guess then if you think of it that way, then wouldn't there be, if there was this mud flood, wouldn't there be catacombs everywhere?
Right. Exactly.
Like, so that makes it more confusing. Like, there wouldn't just be unless Paris for some reason got bodies from all over, but that really doesn't make sense.
Yeah, why would you, exactly.
Like, why would you transport them like just to Paris?
Right.
So it's like basically every like step forward that you take with this theory, there's like 8 steps back of like, okay, yeah, like at base level, you're like, yeah, catacombs, like, yeah, that's fucked up, like 6 million, like that's insane. But then you're like, wait,
is there like history here that I'm not understanding?
Exactly. Like, I don't know the whole history of the catacombs. I don't know, does 6 million make sense? From like a historian's perspective, does that make sense? Somebody who knows about like the actual populations of this city throughout the years, is that like a plausible number?
Right.
And I'm just speaking from like a theoretical standpoint of like, yeah. And again, if that was from a mud flood, then there would be more catacombs, right? Are there catacombs? Like, are there undiscovered catacombs? Is that the idea here? Right. I don't know.
Undiscovered catacombs across the whole planet.
Yeah.
And I don't know. Like, part of it too is like the similarity of architecture. They say that explains why there's like pyramids in like South America, Egypt. Supposedly there's Chinese ones as well. But I feel like, yeah, there'd be like a lot more like continuity across this planet of stuff. Like, yeah, like if the, you know, the Tartarian civilization supposedly like was this global thing, then there would be catacombs in Paris. There'd be catacombs in like, you know, Native American sites. There'd be catacombs in South America, China. Like, it would be a global thing if it was true. Yeah, it's just I don't know. It's one of those topics where I was endlessly fascinated researching it, and yet I was very skeptical reading all of it, because it requires a pretty huge suspension of disbelief. There's a whole subset of people who believe in this, that believe that the Tartarian civilization wasn't wiped out, but that they were driven underground.
Whoa.
And that they're still alive, living as like mole people under the planet.
That makes us even crazier.
Which is so batshit. Like, that's crazy.
It's crazy.
Like,
and this is probably like, again, of all the topics we've ever done, this is probably the one that we personally believe the least.
Right.
I would say, like, pretty fair to say, in this being our 32nd episode, I probably believe in all the other topics we've talked about more than the mud flood.
100%.
Partly saying this just in case there's like any government people that are.
Yes.
We talked about that before we started recording. We're like, feel like we're on some kind of watch list now.
Yeah, you're like delving into these like weird subreddits and like forums and stuff, and you're like 30 pages in.
Oh yeah.
Like deep into some conversation about like, you know, the one world government is keeping this a secret from everybody. And I'm just like, should I be reading this?
Yeah. Should I? Like, I clicked on like every link that there was to find in these forums, and, you know, and then you find like a whole bunch where it's like somebody poses a question and like nobody responds. And like maybe they have an update like a little while later, just like anybody, right? And nobody. And then you're like, oh shit.
Here we go.
Why did nobody respond? Where did that person go?
Right.
Yeah. But this is definitely, yeah. So anybody listening that wants to wipe us out for this, I don't really believe this.
Please don't. Yeah.
I don't think you lied about
this. This is not the hill I want to die on.
No. Like Men in Black, sure.
Yes,
I will die on that hill.
I will die on that hill.
But mud flood, no.
No. And I think this was an interesting foray for me too, to learn about the whole alternative history movement.
Yeah.
Because the part of this that I could totally get behind is that there's massive omissions from the historical record, whether it's because one civilization won a war and like completely wiped out the record of another one. Like, think about what was lost in the burning of the Library of Alexandria. There could be whole civilizations that we have never heard about because all the written documentation of them were wiped out.
Yeah.
Or there's like whole groups of people like the Druids, you know, like the Celts themselves had like a written language and wrote things down, but the Druids, which were like a, you know, subsect of the Celts, they didn't write anything down because it was supposed to be passed on orally from person to person. So there's no written documentation about who the Druids were or what they did, other than like third-hand accounts from like other people. So I totally believe that there are massive civilizations that we have not heard about, that we will probably never hear about. Maybe we know their ruins. Maybe we've like seen their ruins and we call them by something and we theorize about them, but we'll never know like the full extent of who they were and what they did.
Yeah.
So that's the part of this that I find compelling, is like the alternative history, and I guess maybe not alternative history, but like
lost history.
Yeah. Exactly. So that's the part that I took away. I also found this whole thing about the missing 1,000 years myth, if you believe this one guy, that we are actually living in the year like 1,000 something, because the emperor, this Holy Roman Emperor and the Pope Sylvester conspired to make up, you know, several hundred years worth of history, so that their reign would start in like the year 1,000 instead of like 700 something, because it was cooler to be like, oh, my reign started in the year 1,000.
Oh my god, dude.
So there's this whole theory that like the Emperor Constantine wasn't real, or or like that the what's his name, Charlemagne was a fictional person that was completely made up. The whole reason why like the Dark Ages are known as the Dark Ages is because there's no writing that came from that time. There's very little artifacts that have been found from this certain time period, and so they call it the Dark Ages because we don't know anything about it. So the theory is that they weren't Dark Ages, they just didn't exist. So
I mean, really, when you get down to it, and again, like, this is why this is an interesting topic, because it does spur so many discussions. Like, the idea that there's so much of history, and like there will continue to be forever so much of history, that you have to just rely on like whatever was written. And sometimes there's a lot, and sometimes there's not much, but either way, the fact that it's just written and we're now hundreds of years or thousands of years out from it, and there's no way to know definitively, like, did that happen or was it just bullshit?
Right. Think about if you were like 1,000 years from right now.
Yeah.
Okay. You're in 3019, looking back, parsing through the internet, trying to figure out what's real, what's sarcastic, what's an actual like real thing. It's hard enough right now to like read the news and understand what's real and what's fake.
Yeah. Think about how many things get passed along. It's like obvious satire.
Right.
And people are just like, oh,
or
shit.
like Photoshop, or like who? So us trying to interpret things that happened 1,000 years ago, it's like, you know, it's probably kind of true.
Yeah.
But then like how much of it have we like, you know, if somebody came back like forward 1,000 years in time and like read what we were writing about them, they'd be like, dude, that was like our version of Harry Potter. And you guys are like, like basing like this is like our history. Like, no, dude, that was like a children's book.
Well, exactly. There's so much stuff in our current day that just is, and it's not explained anywhere. There's nobody like, I mean, as far as I know, there's nobody currently writing up like, oh, this was a meme. Like, how are people going to figure out in 1,000 years?
Wikipedia is probably the closest we got.
That's true. Wikipedia is the closest thing. Oh yeah, true. So, but yeah, like there wasn't really a thing like that. And like when you think about, in a weird way, like the arrogance of like historians having not lived anywhere close to that time period, being like experts on that time period, it is a little odd because there is just no way to know what was intended by certain things. Yeah, like we don't know what really happened, and all we're relying on, like just like reading the Bible. There's misinterpretations. There are people taking things literally that weren't meant to be taken literally, or maybe they were. We don't fucking know.
We don't know.
That's like the whole basis behind why it's like ridiculous to be like, oh, I'm gonna sneeze.
Apologize to all of our listeners.
That was the loudest thing you've ever
probably so loud.
But yeah, the idea that anybody would what's gonna happen again?
No.
That anybody could say that they know what was intended by anything in the Bible. That's part of why it's ridiculous, because we just don't know. Like that, it's written like, is it written as just a story? Is it just supposed to be like we're gaining a moral from the story? Is it supposed to be this literally happened, or this is just how it felt, or this is what was intended? We don't know. And that, I think, could apply to anything in history, really, of any time period that we didn't come close to living in. Like, we have nobody. I mean, you think really the people that are alive today, even that know people, like you can only, and again, like, and then it's just a lot of it is just oral history. So how much can you trust to be remembered correctly? And you can only go back so many generations where somebody nowadays would have actually spoken to somebody who lived in that time period. You aren't really going back far at all, to be able to be like, no, my grandfather or his grandfather.
Like the last guy who fought in World War I died a few years ago. And like, say in like, 20, 30 years, everybody who fought in World War II will be dead. And so everything we'll have from that will be complete, like, second, third hand accounts.
There's a lot of stuff missing. And even now there's a lot of, like, even if everybody that survived was still alive, you're still only hearing from one person's perspective. And there's still, there's people in those wars that died before they ever got to write down their experience. There's just, there's more holes in everything than there is like substance. So crazy. Then you multiply that by things that happened thousands of years ago. Like, we don't know shit. So
like I can totally believe that there's parts of history that have been conspired to be forgotten. Maybe not, I don't necessarily subscribe to the fact that it's like currently still being like covered up or whatever, but I mean, I could totally believe if you're the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor, you literally have unchecked power. You can do whatever you want. You can like change the calendar if you want. You could make up 300 years and just tell people, hey, it's the year 1000. They're like, isn't it 7 something? And you're like, it's the year 1000 or you will be executed.
And like, oh, all right.
You could actually execute that back then. Like you could make that cover up. So I believe it in some small way that we are believing a lie.
Probably a lot of lies.
Many lies.
Probably a lot of them not even intentional is part of it too. That some of them, it's not even that every lie is a conspiracy, but just some lies might just be ignorance.
Somebody trying to interpret something that they have no cultural context to understand.
It's wild. Even when you think about like even reading like the works of Shakespeare. Which wasn't that long ago. There are still a lot of like unclear what was meant by this. What did this phrase mean? Like things that he made up. As he was writing, like things like that have like become regular language now. Like that's been happening forever.
I mean, speaking of Shakespeare, it's still a debate whether or not Shakespeare was, the guy from Stratford upon Avon. There's Moo Cow barking in the background.
I'm not sure if you can hear that, but there's Moo Cow.
I mean, there's debate about whether Shakespeare was the person who he says he was, or a group of people who were all using the pen name Shakespeare, or like Francis Bacon, like this famous philosopher. So, that's not even that long ago that happened, and it's pretty opaque to us in the 21st century to be able to even interpret that. So
it's wild.
So what do you?
A cooler topic than I thought.
Turned out to be pretty good.
So that is, in essence, the mud flood. Again, you can for sure dive so hard and so far into, again, mostly the Tartarian civilization. But several aspects of this. But that is, in its essence, what the mud flood is.
I would encourage you to go Google mud flood and look at a bunch of photos of partially buried buildings.
Yeah.
And try to come up with your own reason as to like why. I'm sure different buildings were buried for different reasons, but try to come up with a reason why.
Yeah. Give us your feedback.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, this is especially like, I mean, any topic I want to hear about what people think and what their theories are, but for sure this one, I really want to hear about what you think, because it's just so open to interpretation, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we're on Instagram.
Yep.
Come find us on there.
Definitely.
At Unknowable Podcast. And I think we're going to be starting a group on Facebook.
Yep.
Encouraging more interaction like this.
Yeah.
So we can just post about like, hey, we just, recorded this episode, or we just put up this episode. Like, what do you think?
What do you want to hear?
Yeah, what do you want to hear? So keep an eye out for that. We're going to be posting about that probably on Instagram and on our current Facebook page, which is just a fan page.
Yep.
But yeah, come and talk to us and tell us what you think.
What do you think about the mud flood?
Yeah, tell us more. So that was episode 32, Mud Flood.
This has been Unknowable.